I was born to perform. Melancholy is my natural palette, a cold, untouchable distance is my armor. The day I returned to the Beaumont estate to claim my place as the biological daughter, it was pouring. Rain hammered against the windows of the town car, blurring the world into a smudge of gray. I sat in the back seat, chin resting on my palm, my gaze empty and fixed on the streaks of water. I looked exactly like a woman who had just had her heart shattered, though, in truth, I felt nothing at all. My family waited by the car for 5 minutes in the deluge. I didn't move until I felt the silence outside turn from anticipation to irritation. Only then did I step out, moving with a calculated, languid grace. Seraphina, the sister who had been raised in my place, covered her mouth and coughed 3 times, a delicate, sickly sound. She looked at me with wide, watery eyes. Vesper, she whispered, her voice a dandelion puff of faux fragility. Are you going to hate me, for living your life for so long? For having your name? I didn't look at her. I simply stood there in the rain, letting the cold droplets track down my face like silver scars. My mother, Eleanor, rushed forward, her face etched with a performative guilt, trying to shield me with a silk umbrella. I took a sharp step sideways, letting the silk shade nothing but the wet pavement. Don't, I said, my voice flat. I've spent a lifetime walking alone in the rain. I'm used to it. Eleanor's eyes welled up instantly. My older brother, Sebastian, stepped forward, his brow furrowed in a sharp V of disapproval. You just got back and you're already throwing a tantrum? Seraphina is delicate. She doesn't need your theatrics. I didn't even grant him a glance. I simply closed my eyes, letting the freezing rain soak into my skin, savoring the drama of the moment. Harrison Blackwood, the man who was supposed to be my fiancé by some ancient family arrangement, stepped forward. He didn't come to me. He tucked his umbrella over Seraphina's shoulder and pulled her close. Then stay out here and drown, Harrison snapped. The world doesn't revolve around your trauma, Vesper. I finally opened my eyes and looked at him, letting a flicker of hurt dance in my pupils. But hasn't she always been the one at the center of the world, Harrison? Even now? Vesper, you should take a hot bath. I don't want you catching a cold. Seraphina was standing inside the mahogany-framed foyer, holding a plush, snow-white cashmere towel. Her voice was so light it felt like it might dissolve. I stood on the Persian rug in the entryway, water dripping from my clothes. It pooled around my boots, staining the expensive wool a deep, bruised crimson. I didn't speak, I just stared at the towel. It was brand new. Hermes. And in the corner, embroidered in delicate, sprawling script, was the name Seraphina. Why aren't you taking it? Harrison walked over from the living room, plucking the towel from Seraphina's hand. He was in a crisp black dress shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a silver Audemars Piguet glinting on his wrist. Seraphina went to the linen vault specifically to find you something new, he said. His voice was level, not shouting, just stating facts with the cold efficiency of a prosecutor. She was out in the rain too, and she hasn't even had a drop of tea yet because she was worried about you. He stepped closer, the scent of expensive sandalwood and arrogance radiating off him. Vesper, the Beaumont household has rules. You can keep your edge, but you should learn to accept a gesture of kindness. I slowly lifted my eyelids, meeting the gaze of the man I was destined to marry. He was undeniably handsome, dark, deep-set eyes and a jawline that looked carved from marble. He did moral kidnapping so elegantly, so fluently. Is this kindness? I asked. I didn't touch the towel. I turned my head slightly, watching the rain continue its assault on the floor-to-ceiling windows. To dry myself with a cloth that bears her name? I let my gaze drift into the middle distance, looking at nothing. Mr. Blackwood. Don't try to use someone else's warmth to thaw me out. My soul has lived at sub-zero for a long time. The air in the room curdled. Seraphina's eyes turned red with practiced speed. She recoiled half a step, her shoulders trembling. Harrison, don't blame her, she sobbed softly. She's new here. She's overwhelmed. It was my fault for being thoughtless. I'll go tell the housekeeper to find a plain one. She turned to flee toward the servants' wing. Seraphina, stay where you are. A voice, warm but heavy with the weight of authority, drifted down from the landing. Sebastian was leaning against the railing in his silk loungewear, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. He descended the stairs, his gaze sweeping over me with the clinical detachment of a king looking at a peasant. Vesper, he said, using my name with a patronizing sort of grace. I know you've had a hard decade. I know you're bitter. But no one in this house owes you for that. Seraphina gave up the south-facing suite, her favorite room, just so you could have it. She even asked to cancel her own birthday gala tomorrow so you wouldn't feel out of place. He stopped a foot away from me. You walked through that door with a chip on your shoulder. Is this how you prove you were wronged? Or are you just trying to mask how insecure you feel? I looked at my big brother. His analysis was perfect. If I were actually a fragile girl from the sticks, that sentence would have shattered me. Unfortunately for him, I just found them all incredibly loud. I sighed softly. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a peppermint, unwrapped it, and tucked it into my cheek. Mr. Beaumont, I said, as the sharp, icy sting of mint filled my mouth. I looked up at the tiered crystal chandelier above us. Don't try to use your breeding to measure the depth of my abyss. I'm not being difficult. I simply find the thread count of that towel insufficient for my loneliness. Sebastian's jaw tightened. He had likely never been rejected with such casual, nonsensical arrogance. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of ginger tea. Seeing the standoff, she set the tea down hurriedly and took Seraphina's hand. What is going on? She's soaking wet. Get her changed. She felt Seraphina's hand. Oh, darling, you're freezing. I'm fine, Mom, Seraphina chirped, casting a timid, fearful look at me. If Vesper doesn't want the towel, it's okay. Eleanor looked at me, her expression a messy cocktail of guilt and burgeoning resentment. Vesper, tomorrow morning I'm taking you to St. Jude's Academy to finalize your enrollment. She paused. Seraphina is a junior there. You'll be in the same classes. She can look after you. I bit down on the peppermint, swallowing the cold fire. Fine, I said, shoving my wet hands into my pockets and heading for the stairs. As long as she doesn't mind. My rain tends to ruin people's sunshine. The entrance exams for St. Jude's were scheduled for the following morning. St. Jude's didn't care about your zip code or your pedigree, at least, not on paper. They cared about comprehensive excellence and family assets. The former determined if you made it into the alpha track, the latter determined if you survived the 3 years without being bullied into a breakdown. Eleanor had the head tailor from a Madison Avenue boutique at the house by dawn. The living room was draped in silks and cashmeres from the season's newest collections. Vesper, St. Jude's has a strict code, Eleanor said, holding a white cashmere cardigan against Seraphina's chest. You'll wear the uniform for classes, but the private salons and etiquette seminars require your own wardrobe. See anything you like? I sat on the leather sofa, legs crossed, watching the parade of vibrant colors and intricate lace as if I were observing a pile of discarded plastic. No, I said simply. Excessive decoration only serves to mask a hollow soul. The tailor's hand slipped, the measuring tape nearly falling to the floor. Seraphina turned around, looking like a porcelain doll in the white cardigan. Vesper, you don't have to be polite with me. She walked over to the rack, her finger lingering on a black velvet gown. This would suit you. She smiled, a perfect, seamless expression. It's last season, but black is very slimming. And since you've spent so much time working outdoors, well, the darker fabric will hide the tan. Eleanor nodded in agreement. She's right, Vesper. The black is understated. It's better for you to keep a low profile while you adjust. I stood up and walked to the velvet dress. I ran a finger over the fabric. It was stiff, the kind of texture meant for a mannequin, not a human. Low profile? I withdrew my hand and pulled a stray coin from my pocket, flipping it between my knuckles. Even when a lion closes its eyes, the sheep don't feel safe. I looked at Seraphina, watching her smile begin to calcify. Sister, if you're so worried about my complexion, perhaps you should worry more about whether the coming storm will wash off your own mask. Vesper. Harrison's voice cut through the room. He walked in carrying a stack of documents, having caught my last sentence. Seraphina is trying to help you. Why is every word out of your mouth a blade? He walked to her side, naturally taking the measuring tape from her hand. Did the people who raised you teach you to treat kindness like a target? I tossed the coin into the air and caught it blindly. Mr. Blackwood, you really do love the view from the moral high ground, don't you? I looked him in the eye. Be careful. The wind is much stronger up there. You might lose your footing. Harrison's eyes turned cold. He was a man who lived and died by decorum. My words were a direct assault on his sense of order. Since you want nothing, he said, turning to Eleanor, I've already wired the endowment fee to the school under the Blackwood family name. Seraphina has her piano masterclass this afternoon. I'll take her now. Eleanor rubbed her hands together awkwardly. Thank you, Harrison. I'll keep talking to Vesper. Seraphina followed Harrison toward the door, but she stopped at the threshold. Vesper, she said, looking back with a gaze full of condescending pity. St. Jude's isn't like the countryside. The students there value actual ability. If the entrance exam is too hard tomorrow, just leave the pages blank. Don't try to cheat. It would be so embarrassing for the family name. I watched them leave, their silhouettes perfectly synced. A small, ghost-like smile touched my lips. I looked out the window at the clear blue sky. There was no rain today. But I knew a tsunami was coming, and I was the one bringing the tide. Mother, I said to the hovering Eleanor. Just give me a basic ballpoint pen. A genius doesn't need a palette to show her colors. The gates of St. Jude's Academy were a massive arch of white Romanesque stone. When the Beaumont stretched Lincoln pulled up, it caused a stir. Eleanor had a charity brunch with the Junior League, so she hadn't come. The driver, Arthur, opened the door for me. Miss Beaumont, your testing room is in Building A, 3rd floor. He held out a clear folder containing my admissions pass. I didn't take it. I just stepped out of the car, hands in my pockets, and stared at the Gothic Revival architecture. 3,000 years of history, and it's all for prestige and profit, I murmured. 90,000 miles of seeking the way, and it ends in a garden with a bottle of wine. Arthur stood there, the folder shaking slightly in the air, unsure of what to do. I walked past him without a word. The red brick paths were lined with ancient elms. Students moved in clusters, girls in navy blazers and pleated skirts, boys in tailored charcoal suits. They were whispering about Wall Street trends and gallery openings. As I walked by in my plain white button-down and black trousers, the conversations died. 100 pairs of eyes tracked me like spotlights. Is that the lost Beaumont girl? She looks like she walked off a bus. Does she even speak English? I heard she was a farmhand. She's probably going to score a 0 on the placement test. Poor Seraphina. Imagine having that as a sister. I stopped. I turned my head and looked at a girl standing a few feet away. Her Tiffany-clad wrist held a pumpkin spice latte. Her name tag read Penelope. She was the one who had said farmhand. She didn't look away. She lifted her chin, looking at me with a smirk. Do you need directions, sweetie? She asked in a thick, forced mid-Atlantic accent. The remedial wing is in the basement. I stared at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then, I sighed. My eyes softened into an expression of profound, crushing pity. Your vowels, I said, my voice rich with a perfect, effortless French-inflected English. They have the muddy aftertaste of a girl trying too hard to sound like old money. True nobility doesn't need to perform on the tip of her tongue. Penelope's face turned a violent shade of crimson. The whispers around us evaporated. I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I walked toward Building A. The testing hall was a tiered lecture theater on the top floor. When I pushed the heavy oak doors open, I saw Seraphina in the front row. She was surrounded by a clique of girls, a leather-bound copy of Dante's Inferno in her lap. The room went silent. The proctor adjusted his glasses, checking his list. Vesper Beaumont? Your seat is in the back corner. He pointed to a dusty desk next to a trash bin. Since you didn't attend the pre-admission seminar, that's where you'll be. It was a very polite way to isolate someone. Perfectly logical. Entirely cruel. Seraphina stood up, her face a mask of concern. Professor, my sister's eyesight isn't great. Vesper, take my seat. I'll sit in the back. The class erupted in murmurs of admiration. Seraphina is an angel. Why is she so nice to that girl? I looked at Seraphina. It was a flawless performance. I didn't move toward her. Instead, I turned and walked to the back of the room. I pulled out the dusty chair and sat down. No thank you, I said, my voice carrying through the hall. I prefer not to sit in a high-density zone of mediocrity. It affects my focus. Professor, may we begin? The test was a mess of calculated snobbery. It jumped from multivariable calculus to European art history, from international maritime law to translations of obscure dialect poetry. St. Jude's was trying to filter for high-quality human specimens. I twirled my pen. I looked at the questions, so desperate to be difficult, so eager to gatekeep. How boring. I finished the entire packet in 20 minutes. Then, I folded my arms on the desk, watched the leaves flutter outside the window, and closed my eyes. Miss Beaumont. The proctor was standing over me, rapping his knuckles on the wood. If you can't do the work, at least stay awake. You're disrupting the others. His tone was restrained, but his eyes were full of contempt. I opened one eye and sat up. Professor, I said, sliding the test toward him. The questions were so elementary my brain entered a state of defensive hibernation. I'm finished. A few students stifled laughs. The proctor's face went white. He grabbed the paper. If you're so confident, you're free to leave. I stood up and walked out without looking back. At the end of the hall was the school's multipurpose auditorium. That afternoon, they were holding a welcome salon. I slipped inside. It was empty, save for a few student council members setting up the stage. I found a dark corner in the back, put on my noise-canceling headphones, and tuned out the world. At 2 o'clock, the salon began. The freshmen and sophomores gathered. The theme of the day, hidden corners, the melancholy of the elite. What a parody. A group of the most privileged children in the country gathering to discuss the tragedy of their own luxury. Then, it was Seraphina's turn. She wore a white lace dress, clutching a cello. The lights dimmed, and a single spotlight found her. She played a piece of staggering sadness, a dirge that echoed through the hall. When she finished, she walked to the microphone. A single, perfect tear sat on her cheek. I've always lived in fear, she whispered into the mic. Knowing that I wasn't the real daughter. That I was taking up space that belonged to someone else. I worked so hard, played so many hours, just to feel like I had a right to exist here. The room erupted in thunderous applause. Girls were dabbing at their eyes. Penelope stood up and shouted, Seraphina, you are the pride of St. Jude's. Blood doesn't matter, excellence does. In the front row, Harrison watched her with a gaze so tender it was nauseating. The moderator took the mic, his voice booming. A moving tribute. And we know that the other Beaumont daughter, Vesper, is here with us today. The spotlight began to roam, searching the crowd. Vesper Beaumont? In the face of your sister's honesty, her grace, and her struggle, do you have anything to share? Or perhaps you'd like to show us who you really are? It was a public execution. They were using vulnerability as a weapon to force me into a corner. I took off my headphones and stood up. I walked down the aisle, step by step, until I stood in the glare of the spotlight. I didn't take the microphone from the moderator. I just stood there, looking at them. Melancholy? I let out a short, sharp laugh. I pushed a stray hair behind my ear. You call your fragile, sheltered lives melancholy because you've never seen a real storm? I looked at Seraphina. My eyes were empty, devoid of any warmth. My sister's playing was pretty. But it was a performance of pain, not the thing itself. I tilted my head, looking past the audience into the darkness at the back of the room. I have no empathy for the common world. A woman on horseback does not need to apologize to the grass for treading on it. The silence was deafening. I had shattered the decorum of the salon. Seraphina turned pale, her fake smile failing. Suddenly, crash. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall were kicked open. Not a frantic kick, but a casual, bored shove. A boy in a black leather motorcycle jacket, his hair a shock of defiant silver, sauntered in. He was flipping a Swiss Army knife in one hand. The room stopped breathing. Killian Knightley. The only son of the Knightley conglomerate. The forbidden fruit of St. Jude's. He didn't bully people, he simply existed, and the stock prices of his enemies' companies dropped by billions. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on me in the spotlight. He tucked the knife away and broke into a wide, strangely submissive grin. He jogged down the aisle toward the stage. Boss, he shouted, his voice full of a puppy-like excitement. I didn't know you were coming to this dump today. The silence in the auditorium was neither gentle nor polite. It was the sudden, suffocating vacuum left behind when an artillery shell hits a ballroom. Killian Knightley did not care about acoustics. He jogged up the mahogany stairs. To the stage, 2 steps at a time, the silver chain on his black denim clinking. Like loose coinage. When he reached the perimeter of the spotlight where I stood, he skidded to an unceremonious halt, ran a hand through his shock of silver-dyed hair, and beamed with an enthusiasm that looked entirely unnatural. On a boy whose family owned half the commercial ports along the eastern seaboard. Boss, Killian repeated, leaning forward, resting his hands on his knees like an overgrown wolfhound waiting for a tennis ball. You didn't text the group chat. I was in Geneva until 4 this morning because Mikhail said the crude oil futures were dipping, but then Julian called from the London desk and said you were spotted boarding a domestic commuter flight to this godforsaken zip code. Why didn't you have the jet fueled? The auditorium held approximately 400 people. None of them drew breath. In the front row, Harrison Blackwood had risen halfway out of his seat. His tailored suit jacket remained unbuttoned, his expression frozen somewhere between aristocratic outrage and sheer cognitive dissonance. Beside him, Seraphina sat with her cello resting between her knees, her pale fingers gripping the varnished neck so hard that the knuckles turned the color of lard. Killian? Penelope's voice cracked from the 3rd row, shrill and bewildered. Killian, what are you doing? That's the girl from the farm. She's Seraphina's stray sister. Killian didn't look back. Without turning his head, he flicked his wrist. The half-inch silver pocket knife he had been twirling snapped open with a lethal, metallic snick. He didn't point it at her, he merely shaved a sliver of dried lacquer off the corner of the moderator's podium. Who let the megaphone with the fake pearl speak? Killian said, his voice dropping from manic delight to a flat, arctic baritone. Sit down before I buy your father's logistics firm and turn the corporate headquarters into a municipal dog shelter. Penelope collapsed back into her velvet seat as if someone had snipped her strings. I looked at Killian. I didn't smile. I didn't blink. I simply pulled another peppermint from the pocket of my black trousers, stripped the cellophane with one hand, and slipped it past my lips. You're loud, Killian, I murmured. The acoustics in this room are already suffering from a terminal lack of taste. Don't add diesel exhaust to the tragedy. Killian instantly snapped the blade shut, slid it into his sleeve, and straightened his back like a private standing before a general. Understood. My volume was uncalibrated. Forgive the intrusion, boss. What is the meaning of this? The voice belonged to Dean Vance. He had appeared from the side wings, his academic robe billowing around his portly frame like the sail of a listing galleon. His cheeks were mottled red, his gold pince-nez trembling on the bridge of his nose. Mr. Knightley, this is a formal symposium on student interiority. Miss Beaumont was simply participating in the salon. Participating? Killian turned his head slowly, his gray eyes dead and level. It looked to me like a flock of well-fed pigeons trying to lecture a hawk on the mechanics of altitude. Killian. Harrison's voice was low, vibrating with the practiced authority of a future senator. He stepped into the center aisle, moving toward the stage with measured, deliberate strides. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, looking up at us. Control yourself. You're making a spectacle of St. Jude's in front of the entire junior cohort. And you, he turned his dark, prosecutorial eyes on me. You have been here less than 4 hours, Vesper, and you've already turned a sanctuary of culture into a street brawl. Does your need for attention know any limit? I walked to the edge of the stage. The glare of the overhead spotlight caught the silver specks in my dark pupils. I looked down at Harrison Blackwood, this immaculate prince of hedge funds and inherited pedigree. A sanctuary? I asked softly, the peppermint clicking against the back of my teeth. Mr. Blackwood, you mistake a gilded cage for a cathedral. You sit down. There, dressed in your family's compound interest, confusing your boredom with suffering and your vanity with virtue. If my silence offends your fragile peace, put cotton in your ears. I am not an exhibit for your redemption. You, Harrison took a sharp step forward, his jaw clenching so violently a muscle twitched beneath his ear. Harrison, please. Seraphina was suddenly there, abandoning her cello to rush to Harrison's arm. She looked up at him with eyes swimming in fresh, incandescent tears. Her small hand gripped his lapel, trembling with such theatrical precision it belonged in the Comédie Française. Don't fight with her because of me, she wept, her voice carrying across the silent hall. It's my fault. I shouldn't have played that piece. Vesper has lived through so much darkness, she doesn't understand our world yet. She thinks our kindness is an attack. If someone has to leave the academy, let it be me. I'll go back to the country house. Just don't let this tear the family apart. A collective murmur of heartbreak rippled through the gallery. Several girls in the front row began to sniffle in sympathetic solidarity. I looked at Seraphina. I looked at the slight tilt of her chin, the 4mm drop of her shoulder designed to emphasize her collarbones, the breathy cadence of a girl who had rehearsed martyrdom in front of a full-length mirror every day since she was 7 years old. Sister, I said, my voice cutting through her sniffles like a diamond through window glass. Your tears are very economical. You spend 3 drops and expect everyone in the room to pay your bill. Seraphina froze. If you wish to leave for the country house, I continued, stepping down the stairs with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, hands buried deep in my pockets, do not announce it to 400 strangers like a railway schedule. Simply pack your Louis Vuitton trunks and go. The grass will not wither without you, and the sun will manage to rise without your permission. Vesper Beaumont. Dean Vance thundered, finally finding his footing. That is quite enough. You have shown nothing but contempt for the faculty, the traditions of this institution, and your own flesh and blood. You were admitted conditionally on the basis of a diagnostic evaluation. Given your current attitude, I have every reason to. Before the dean could finish his sentence, the heavy side doors of the auditorium slammed back against the wall with a deafening bang. 2 men in crisp gray suits entered, flanking a tall, emaciated figure in an academic gown trimmed with purple velvet, the highest tier of the International Baccalaureate Directorate. It was Chancellor Sterling, the reclusive chairman of the Board of Regents who hadn't stepped foot on the St. Jude's campus in 3 years. In his right hand, he held a single, unsealed manila folder. Dean Vance's face instantly drained of color. Chancellor Sterling? We were not informed of your visit today. We were merely conducting the incoming student salon. Sterling didn't look at Vance. He didn't look at Harrison, nor did he acknowledge Seraphina's trembling presence. He walked directly toward the stage, his leather shoes clicking on the hardwood with the cadence of a metronome. When he reached the foot of the stairs, he stopped. He looked at me, his eyes wide behind thick wire frames, his fingers trembling slightly against the folder. Who authorized a placement diagnostic for this candidate? Sterling's voice was not loud, but it possessed the terrifying weight of undisputed power. Dean Vance swallowed hard. Chancellor, standard procedure dictates that any unscheduled transfer, especially those from unaccredited rural backgrounds, must complete the comprehensive excellence battery. Miss Beaumont took the exam this morning in lecture hall A. Sterling slowly turned his head to look at Vance. Did she? Yes, Vance stammered, casting an uneasy glance toward Harrison. And, while she completed it in an insolently short amount of time, her demeanor was thoroughly disruptive. The exam, Sterling interrupted, opening the folder and pulling out 3 sheets of paper covered in dense, blue ballpoint handwriting, was designed in 1984 by the Cambridge Syndicate. In 40 years, no individual has ever Solved the 5th section on non-Euclidean topological vectors without computational aid. Not even the faculty. He turned the page toward Vance. She didn't just solve it, Sterling whispered, his voice shaking. She identified a clerical error in the baseline coordinate theorem printed on page 4, corrected the variable in the margin using classical Greek notation, and used the remaining white space on the back to draft a counterproof to the Riemann hypothesis in 12 lines of iambic heptameter. The auditorium plunged into a silence so absolute that the hum of the fluorescent light sounded like a buzzsaw. Harrison's eyes darted from Sterling to the sheets of paper, then to me. His expression was no longer merely angry, it was fracturing. Seraphina took a step backward, her foot catching on the hem of her lace gown. Chancellor, there must be a mistake. Vesper didn't even attend high school. She was working on a collective vineyard in the Pyrenees. Vineyard? Killian snorted from the stage, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh. That bounced off the mahogany walls. A collective vineyard? You idiot. She owns the mountain. I didn't wait for Sterling to offer an award, nor did I wait for Vance to stutter an apology. I stepped past Harrison Blackwood, the hem of my plain cotton shirt brushing against the sleeve of his Tom Ford suit. Keep the folder, Chancellor, I said without breaking stride, heading down the center aisle toward the grand exits. The paper was rough, the ink was cheap. And the questions were 40 years past their prime. If this is the ceiling of St. Jude's, your sky is far too low. Killian fell in 2 paces behind me, whistling a jaunty, discordant tune. Behind us, Harrison Blackwood called my name. His voice lacked its former icy detachment, it held a sharp, raw edge of humiliation. Vesper. I pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the cold afternoon air, and let the doors slam shut behind me without looking back. The Beaumont Manor in the evening looked like a Victorian asylum renovated by an interior designer with an addiction to white Carrara marble. By 6 o'clock, the rain had returned. It fell in heavy, rhythmic sheets, turning the manicured lawn into a drowned swamp of clipped boxwoods and crushed limestone. Inside the grand dining room, the temperature was kept at a strict 68 degrees, the precise climate required to keep Eleanor's imported orchids from wilting and Sebastian's temper from boiling over. The long mahogany table was set for 6. Sterling silver cutlery, Wedgwood china, and crystal stemware that caught the dull, yellow light of 3 candelabras. Sebastian Beaumont sat at the head of the table in place of our absent father, who was indefinitely detained in Singapore handling an offshore merger. Sebastian was wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit, his gold-rimmed glasses resting on the bridge of his nose as he reviewed a stack of balance sheets while the butler poured the soup. To his right sat Eleanor, whose face was a study in nervous exhaustion. To his left sat Seraphina, who had changed into a modest, dove-gray cashmere sweater that made her look like a wounded dove. And sitting opposite Seraphina was Harrison Blackwood. I sat at the far end, adjacent to an empty chair that was technically reserved for Killian, who had declined to come inside, preferring to park his matte black Ducati on the front lawn with its high beams pointed directly at the living room bay windows. The soup is cold, Sebastian said, not looking up from his quarterly reports. It's vichyssoise, darling, Eleanor murmured softly, her fingers fidgeting with a pearl necklace. It's meant to be cold. I know what it is, mother, Sebastian said, his tone razor-thin. I'm talking about the atmosphere. He laid his fountain pen down on the linen tablecloth with a soft, ominous click. He removed his glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, and finally looked down the length of the table at me. I was eating bread. Not delicately, not clumsily, just tearing small pieces off a sourdough roll and chewing them with a steady, rhythmic indifference, watching the raindrops slide down the dark window panes behind Harrison's head. Harrison told me what happened at the academy today, Sebastian began, his voice deep, controlled, and dripping with corporate condescension. You made a scene. You insulted Dean Vance. You humiliated your sister in front of the entire student body, and you allowed the nightly boy to treat the St. Jude's salon like a dockside tavern. He paused, waiting for my defense. I chewed my bread. I swallowed. I took a sip of ice water. Are you finished with the summary, Mr. Beaumont? I asked, setting my glass down without making a sound on the tablecloth. Or is there a PowerPoint presentation to accompany this audit of my sins? Sebastian's eyes narrowed. Do you think you're untouchable because Chancellor Sterling was impressed by some parlor trick on an old exam paper? St. Jude's is not an academic competition, Vesper. It is an ecosystem of alliances. By offending the Blackwoods and the Vance family on your first day, you have effectively placed a short on our family's social capital. Social capital? I let out a soft, dry exhale that was almost a laugh. If you're Family's capital is so easily devalued by a few truthful sentences in an auditorium. You aren't running an empire, Sebastian. You're running a lemonade stand with a chandelier. Vesper. Eleanor gasped, pressing a linen napkin to her mouth. How can you speak to your brother like that? He has worked 15 hours a day since he was 22 to protect this name, the name you abandoned for 17 years. I didn't abandon it, Mother, I said, turning my gaze toward her. My voice was a calm, level lake of ice. I was misplaced in a maternity ward by a private clinic your husband forgot to pay on time. Do not confuse your negligence with my choice. Eleanor flinched as if I had struck her with an iron rod. That's enough, Harrison interrupted. His voice was thick with suppressed fury. He pushed his bowl aside, leaning across the table toward me. The silver Audemars Piguet on his wrist caught the candlelight, throwing a sharp glint of steel across his jaw. You think you're very clever, don't you? Harrison said, his dark eyes locking onto mine. You hide behind this bizarre, nihilistic vocabulary. You act like you're above wealth, above manners, above basic human decency. But do you know what I see when I look at you, Vesper? A mirror? I suggested mildly. Though I doubt your ego could survive the reflection. I see a child who was left out in the cold for too long, and now you want to burn the house down just so everyone else feels the draft. Harrison's voice was venomously calm. You resent Seraphina because she was loved. You resent Sebastian because he has power. And you resent me because you know that no matter what ancient blood pact our grandfathers signed, I will never, ever look at a creature as bitter and deformed by hatred as you are with anything other than disgust. Seraphina let out a small, trembling gasp, reaching out to touch Harrison's sleeve. Harrison, don't, please. She's still my sister. She's a viper, Seraphina, Harrison said, not taking his eyes off me. And she needs to learn that in this world, venom doesn't make you a dragon. It just makes you a pest. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I didn't drop my gaze. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the small silver coin I had been flipping earlier that morning, and placed it on the table between my knife and fork. Mr. Blackwood, I said, my voice dropping so low that even the rain outside seemed to quiet down to listen. You speak of houses, drafts, and dragons with the confidence of a boy who has never spent a night without central heating. I picked up the heavy silver butter knife, rested the tip against the rim of my crystal wine glass, and tapped it once. Ping. The pure, high-frequency note hung in the air, vibrating against the mahogany. You believe Seraphina was loved? I asked, tilting my head slightly. No. She was maintained like a lawn or a luxury sports car. She was curated to be the ornamental cherry on the Beaumont estate's financial portfolio. And you, I looked directly into Harrison's pupils. You didn't fall in love with her grace. You fell in love with her obedience. You wanted a wife who would look up at you like you were God, because deep down, in the dark corners where your trust funds can't reach, you know you are nothing more than an empty suit with a family crest. Harrison stood up so violently his mahogany chair screeched against the parquet floor. You insolent. Sit down, Harrison, Sebastian commanded. Harrison didn't sit, but he froze, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. Sebastian turned to me, his face pale, the corporate mask slipping to reveal the ruthless operator beneath. Tomorrow night is the St. Jude's Autumn Charity Gala at the Blackwood Pavilion. The endowment for the new Biological Sciences wing will be announced. Seraphina will perform the opening cello suite with the Philharmonic Quartet. The Beaumont family will pledge $10 million. He leaned forward, placing both palms flat on the mahogany table. You will attend, Vesper, Sebastian said, each word enunciated with absolute finality. You will wear the gown Eleanor selected for you. You will sit at the family table. You will not speak unless spoken to, and when Harrison announces the Blackwood Beaumont Joint Foundation, you will smile and applaud. If you embarrass this family again, I will have the trust fund revoked. I will terminate your legal status as an heir, and you can go back to whatever gutter in Europe you crawled out of. I picked up my coin, tossed it into the air, caught it with a snap of my wrist, and stood up. Mr. Beaumont, I said, smoothing down the front of my shirt. A trust fund is a leash for dogs who don't know how to hunt. Keep your 10 million. You're going to need every penny of it by midnight tomorrow. I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room. As I climbed the marble staircase to the drafty, south-facing bedroom, I could hear Seraphina's delicate, shuddering sobs echoing from the foyer below, punctuated by the steady, furious cadence of Harrison's promises to destroy me. I reached my room, shut the heavy oak door, and didn't bother to turn on the light. I walked to the French doors, stepped out onto the cold, rain-swept balcony, and looked down. Killian was sitting on the hood of his motorcycle in the pouring rain, an umbrella resting casually over his shoulder, eating a bag of warm churros. When he saw me, he held up a grease-stained paper bag. "Boss," he shouted over the rumble of thunder. "Did you finish your soup?" Mikhail just texted. The Hong Kong clearinghouse signed the acquisition papers. You now own 41% of Blackwood Maritime Holdings. Do you want me to crash their stock at market open, or do you want to wait until dessert? Tomorrow? I leaned against the stone balustrade, letting the freezing rain soak into my sleeves, feeling the sharp, beautiful chill of the night settle into my bones. Wait until dessert, Killian, I called down softly. It's bad manners to ruin an appetite before the main course. The Blackwood Pavilion was built to simulate an imperial conservatory. Suspended over the rocky cliffs of the northern bay, the glass and steel structure glowed like a faceted diamond in the October fog. Inside, 700 members of the eastern seaboard's financial royalty stood upon black marble floors, surrounded by imported white hydrangeas and 3 tiers of champagne fountains. A string quartet played a sanitized, polite rendition of Vivaldi's Winter. Seraphina was the undisputed sun around which the room orbited. She wore a custom off-the-shoulder gown of silver tulle, embroidered with thousands of microcrystals that caught the light with every fluttering movement. Her hair was swept up in a loose, romantic chignon, exposing the delicate curve of her neck. On her collarbone rested the Blackwood heirloom necklace, a string of unheated Burmese sapphires surrounding a 5-carat tear-shaped diamond known as the Blue Monarch. Harrison stood at her side, radiant in a midnight blue tuxedo, holding a glass of vintage Krug. Every time a senator, an ambassador, or a hedge fund titan stopped to offer congratulations, Harrison's hand rested possessively on the small of Seraphina's back. "She's magnificent, Harrison," whispered Lady Evelyn, the matriarch of the Newport racing dynasty. "So gentle, so refined. A true Beaumont. And so brave. Given the unfortunate rumors about that girl from the provinces." Harrison smiled, a tight, triumphant smirk. "The Beaumont name has endured for 2 centuries, Lady Evelyn. A stray gust of wind cannot shake an oak tree. We have the situation entirely under control." "And the other girl?" Lady Evelyn peered through her gold lorgnette toward the dark corners of the room. "Is she here?" "She is in the back," Harrison said, his tone dripping with dismissive pity. "Sebastian insisted she attend to learn how society conducts itself. But I assure you, she won't be speaking." I was, indeed, in the back. I was leaning against a black steel support column near the service entrance, holding an untouched flute of sparkling mineral water. I had not worn Eleanor's black velvet dress. Instead, I wore a sharply tailored, double-breasted suit of charcoal wool, custom-cut with razor-sharp lapels, no tie, the crisp white collar of my shirt unbuttoned at the throat. My hair was pulled back into a severe, sleek knot at the base of my neck. I looked less like an aspiring debutante and more like an executioner who had arrived 30 minutes early for an appointment. Eleanor had nearly had an aneurysm when I walked down the stairs of the manor an hour ago. "You look like a banker at an inquest," she had shrieked. "Death is the ultimate auditor, Mother," I had replied. "I prefer to dress for the final balance." Across the room, Sebastian was holding court with the president of the New York Stock Exchange and the Austrian consul. He looked over at me once, his eyes flashing with a cold, warning glare that clearly said, "Stay in the shadows." I took a slow sip of water. The cold liquid was clean, sharp, and utterly devoid of sugar. Perfect. "Boss." Killian appeared out of the service corridor, sliding past 2 waiters carrying silver trays of beluga caviar. He was wearing an identical charcoal suit, though. He had left his jacket open to reveal a silver chain necklace and a vintage silk shirt printed with faded tarot cards. "The satellite uplink is live," Killian murmured, leaning his shoulder against the iron pillar next to me. "Mikhail is sitting in the control van 3 blocks away. Julian has the short positions ready on the London, Frankfurt, and Tokyo exchanges. The moment you drop your coin, the Blackwood Group loses its debt-to-equity compliance." "Patience, Killian," I said, watching Seraphina giggle into Harrison's shoulder as a flashbulb went off. "Revenge taken in haste is merely a brawl. Revenge executed with precision is high art." At 8 o'clock, the chimes sounded. The lights in the conservatory dimmed to a deep, dramatic sapphire blue. A single white follow spot illuminated the center stage, where a custom mahogany platform had been erected. Dean Vance stepped to the microphone, tapping it twice. "Distinguished guests, patrons of the arts, and friends of St. Jude's Academy." Vance began, his voice booming through the 4-way speaker array. "Tonight, we Celebrate the triumph of heritage, excellence, and charity. Before we open the bidding for our annual scholarship fund, we are privileged to witness a performance by St. Jude's most gifted prodigy, Miss Seraphina Beaumont, accompanied by the Blackwood String Quartet. Applause rippled through the hall like dry leaves before a storm. Seraphina took the stage, moving with that practiced, fragile hesitation that made every man over 40 in the room feel an instinctive urge to write a six-figure check to protect her. She sat behind a rare 18th century testor cello, adjusted her silver tulle skirt, closed her eyes, and lifted the bow. The room fell into a reverent hush. The piece was announced on the program as Elegy for the Lost Season, an original composition allegedly written by Seraphina herself during her retreat in Salzburg last summer. The bow touched the strings. The music was undeniably beautiful. It was a mournful, cascading melody in D minor, filled with soaring arpeggios that mimicked the sound of winter rain falling upon stone ruins. It was lush, sentimental, and engineered to extract tears from an audience that evaluated art strictly by how expensive it made them feel. In the front row, Eleanor was already dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Harrison watched with a look of smug, proprietary pride. Beside me, Killian let out a low whistle. She's got good muscle memory, I'll give her that. Stole it note for note. She missed the phrasing in the seventh measure, I said quietly, watching Seraphina's fingers tremble over the fingerboard. She plays the sadness like an actress playing Ophelia. She knows where to look frantic, but she doesn't know why the water is cold. When the final note faded into the cavernous glass ceiling, the pavilion erupted. People rose to their feet. Bravo calls echoed from the VIP tables. Harrison was the first to stand, clapping with hard, rhythmic intensity, looking around the room to ensure everyone witnessed his approval. Seraphina stood, curtsied deeply, and pressed her hand to her heart, her face radiant with faux humility. Thank you, she whispered into the microphone, her voice trembling with emotion. This piece, I wrote it for my family. For my brother Sebastian, who carries our name. For Harrison, who is my anchor. And for my sister Vesper, who has returned to us from the dark. 700 heads turned simultaneously to look at the back of the room where I stood against the iron pillar. The spotlight swung violently across the conservatory, blinding me in a circle of white, clinical light. The whispers began instantly. Look at her, she didn't even wear a dress. She looks like a bodyguard. How graceless. Not even clapping for her sister. Harrison stepped onto the stage, taking the microphone from Vance with an easy, commanding authority. He looked across the sea of tuxedos and gowns, straight into the glare of the light where I stood. A truly transcendent composition, Harrison announced, his deep voice carrying an unmistakable edge of cruelty. True nobility does not merely inherit greatness, it creates it. Seraphina has proven tonight that St. Jude's produces leaders of culture. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was taut as a wire. We know that Miss Vesper Beaumont has recently returned to our community. Harrison continued, smiling coldly. There have been questions about her integration. But as the future head of the Blackwood-Beaumont Alliance, I believe in second chances. Vesper, your sister has dedicated her masterpiece to you. Surely, as a daughter of the Beaumont bloodline, you have a few words of gratitude? Or perhaps you would like to demonstrate what artistic heritage you bring to our family? It was a trap, constructed with the ruthless simplicity of an executioner's block. If I stayed silent, I was an ungrateful, uncultured savage from the provinces who proved Harrison's narrative. If I spoke in my usual detached aphorisms, I would be laughed out of the room as an eccentric fraud. Sebastian, standing at table 1, raised his champagne glass slightly, a subtle, terrifying gesture of warning. Do not move. I handed my glass of water to Killian. Hold this, I said. Want me to break his kneecaps on the way up? Killian asked cheerfully. No, I replied, stepping out of the shadows. Kneecaps heal. Pride does not. I walked down the central aisle of the Blackwood Pavilion. The crowd parted before me like water before the prow of an ironclad ship. The click of my leather-soled boots against the black marble was the only sound in the cavernous room, sharp and rhythmic, cutting through the murmurs of the elite. I didn't rush. I didn't look at Eleanor, whose face was contorted in horror. I didn't look at Sebastian, whose knuckles were white where he gripped his crystal flute. I climbed the stairs to the stage. Harrison stood tall, his jaw set in a victory smirk, extending the microphone toward me like a bone thrown to a stray. I didn't take the microphone. I walked past him as if he were a piece of stage machinery, stopping directly in front of the 18th century testor cello resting on its stand. Seraphina took an involuntary step back, clutching Harrison's arm. Vesper. Please, if you don't like classical music, you don't have to. Quiet, I said. The word was not shouted. It was spoken with such terrifying, sub-zero authority that Seraphina's mouth snapped shut instantly. I reached out and ran a single index finger along the C string of the instrument. The wood hummed under my touch. A fine instrument, I remarked, my voice amplified by the stage monitors. Made in Milan, 1742. Carlo Giuseppe Testor. Bought at Christie's, London 3 years ago by the Blackwood Trust for $1.8 million. Harrison frowned, his brow furrowing. What does the provenance of the cello have to do with your lack of manners? It has everything to do with provenance, Mr. Blackwood, I said, turning to face the 700 guests. My gaze swept over them, cold, dissecting, completely devoid of fear. My sister claims she composed Elegy for the Lost Season in Salzburg last summer, I said, my voice level and melodic, carrying effortlessly to the highest rafters of the glass roof. A moving story. A tragic piece. But there is a small, administrative problem with her narrative. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my charcoal suit jacket. I pulled out a small, black lacquered USB drive and a single sheet of yellowed parchment, sealed in a preservation sleeve. The piece she just performed is not called Elegy for the Lost Season, I said calmly. It is titled The Third Winter of St. Malo. It was composed in October 1917 by Julian Vance, the great-grandfather of our esteemed Dean Vance, while he was stationed on the French front. A sharp, electric shock seemed to pass through the front row. Dean Vance suddenly went the color of curdled milk. That's absurd. Seraphina cried, her voice reaching a frantic, shrill pitch. I wrote it. I have the manuscript in my room. Harrison, tell her. Vesper, this is slander. Harrison snarled, stepping forward, his hands balling into fists. You are fabricating lies because you cannot bear Seraphina's talent. Security. Julian Vance never published the score, I continued, completely ignoring Harrison's outburst. Because he was killed in the trenches 48 hours after completing the third movement. The only copy of the original manuscript was kept in the private archives of the Vance family estate in Brittany, an estate that was purchased 2 months ago by an anonymous private equity firm. I looked down at Dean Vance, who was clutching the edge of his table, his knees visibly shaking. Dean Vance, I murmured, my eyes narrowing into slits of pure ice. How much did Harrison Blackwood pay you to pull that manuscript from your family vault and hand it to Seraphina so she could win the National Youth Laureate? Was it $2 million? Or was it merely the Blackwood family's promise to fund the new campus wing? Security. Get her off the stage. Sebastian roared from table 1, abandoning all semblance of aristocratic decorum. He lunged toward the stairs, his face purple with rage. Don't touch her. Killian Knightley was suddenly at the base of the stairs. He didn't raise his fists. He merely held up his phone, screen facing the crowd. On the massive, 90-foot LED projection screens flanking the stage, screens that were supposed to display the Blackwood Charity Foundation promotional video, a document flickered into existence. It was a high-resolution scan of a bank transfer receipt from the Blackwood private wealth management account in Zurich to Dean Vance's offshore account in the Cayman Islands, dated August 14th. The memo line read, Acquisition of Vance. Archival music material, confidential. Directly beneath it was a side-by-side comparison of Seraphina's original sheet music and Julian Vance's 1917 handwritten score. They were identical, down to the accidental sharp in the 9th bar. The conservatory turned into an absolute madhouse. Reporters from the financial and cultural desks began snapping photos with machine gun speed. Flashbulbs strobed across the room, illuminating Seraphina's face, which had collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. No, Harrison, it wasn't like that. Seraphina whimpered, backing away toward the velvet curtains, her gown catching on the microphone stand and sending it crashing to the floor with a deafening screech of feedback. Harrison stood frozen in the center of the stage. The arrogant, untouchable Prince of Wall Street looked as though he had been hit by a high-speed locomotive. His eyes darted from the giant screens to Seraphina, then to Sebastian, and finally to me. You. Harrison choked out, his voice cracking like dry wood. Who are you? How did you get those records? I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. I stopped 6 inches away. The scent of my cold peppermint cut through his expensive sandalwood cologne. I told you yesterday, Mr. Blackwood, I whispered, so only he and the trembling Seraphina could hear. Don't try to use your breeding to measure the depth of my abyss. You thought I was a stray coming to beg for crumbs at your table. I reached out and casually plucked the blue monarch sapphire pendant from Seraphina's collarbone. The delicate gold chain snapped with a brittle ping. Seraphina shrieked, but she didn't dare move. I held the 5-carat diamond up to the light, turning it between my fingers. A pretty stone, I said, tossing it carelessly onto the stage floor, where it bounced twice and rolled into the dust near Harrison's polished shoes. Counterfeit nobility worships glass and titles. But real power, Harrison. Real power doesn't ask for a seat at the table. Real power buys the building. Fires the staff, and leaves you out in the rain. Boss, Killian's voice came through the stage monitors, lazy and amused. The Tokyo market just opened. Blackwood Maritime Holdings is down 32%. Sebastian's short-term liquidity facility has been frozen by the Zurich Central Clearinghouse. Sebastian stopped dead at the base of the stairs. His phone was vibrating violently in his suit pocket, once, twice, 5 times in 3 seconds. He pulled it out with shaking fingers. He looked at the screen. The color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse in a 3-piece suit. The syndicate, Sebastian stammered, looking up at me as if seeing a phantom. The private equity syndicate that bought our mezzanine debt last month. The Ouroboros Group, that was you? I didn't answer him. I walked to the cello, pulled out a handkerchief from my pocket, wiped the dust off the bridge, and turned to look at Eleanor Beaumont. My biological mother was sitting at her table, her hands clutching her head, weeping in total, unmitigated humiliation. She looked at Seraphina, her darling, perfect creation, who was currently curled in a fetal position behind the grand piano, sobbing hysterically as society women pointed and gossiped. Then Eleanor looked at me. For the first time in 17 years, she looked at me not with guilt, not with pity, but with pure, unadulterated awe and terror. Vesper. Eleanor gasped, reaching out a trembling hand across the black marble. Vesper, darling, we're your family. We gave you your name. You can't ruin your brother, you can't destroy our home. I walked down the stairs, stepping over the scattered sheets of Seraphina's stolen music. I stopped beside Eleanor's table. I looked down at her. Mother, I said softly, my voice as calm as a frozen pond. When I stood in the rain yesterday, you brought an umbrella made of silk. It was very expensive, but it kept no one dry. You gave my name to a shadow, and you expected the shadow to sing. I pulled a crisp, white linen handkerchief from my breast pocket, plain, unembroidered, without a single family crest or monogram. I laid it gently on the table next to her untouched champagne. Dry your eyes, I murmured. Melancholy is a luxury for the rich. Tomorrow morning, you will need to learn how to budget. Harrison lunged toward me, grabbing my shoulder. Vesper. You can't do this. The Blackwood family has lines of credit with every central bank in. Before his fingers could fully tighten on my wool jacket, Killian stepped between us. Killian didn't draw a knife. He merely leaned in close, smiling with all 32 teeth, his gray eyes flashing with dangerous, unhinged glee. Touch her again, Harrison, Killian whispered softly, and I won't just short your stock. I'll buy your family cemetery, dig up your ancestors, and turn the crypt into a themed paintball arena. Try me. I have $80 billion in liquid cash and nothing to do on Thursdays. Harrison's hand fell away as if he had touched white-hot iron. He stumbled back. His face completely hollowed out, the great, invincible master of the universe, reduced to a trembling boy in an ill-fitting tuxedo. I turned my back on the stage. I turned my back on the crying girl in the silver dress. I turned my back on the brother whose empire was crumbling into digits on a phone screen, and the mother who had never known the color of my eyes. Killian, I said, walking toward the grand glass exits of the Blackwood Pavilion. Right behind you, boss. Get the car. The air in this conservatory smells like cheap perfume and borrowed time. The storm outside was at its peak. The wind howling off the northern bay whipped the Atlantic into a frenzy of black, foam-capped waves that smashed against the jagged rocks 50 feet below the pavilion cliffs. Rain fell in violent, horizontal sheets, drumming a deafening tattoo against the glass canopy. I stepped through the heavy revolving doors and out onto the stone terrace. The cold hit me instantly, sharp, pure, and merciless. It stripped away the lingering stench of champagne, the suffocating heat of 700 terrified hypocrites, and the pathetic warmth of their manufactured world. Killian walked up beside me, pulling a pair of leather riding gloves over his fingers. The jet is fueled at Teterboro, Killian said, his silver hair plastered to his forehead by the deluge. Julian has the penthouse in Milan opened. Mikhail says. The London desk is throwing a party because we just cleared 400 million. On the Blackwood short. Where are we going, boss? I stood at the edge of the stone terrace, hands buried deep in the pockets of my Charcoal trousers, looking out over the dark, turbulent ocean. Behind us, the pavilion doors burst open. Harrison Blackwood ran out into the pouring rain. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket, his white shirt was instantly soaked through, clinging to his chest like a shroud. His slicked back hair was ruined, falling into his eyes in wild, frantic strands. Vesper, he screamed over the roar of the wind. He ran across the wet flagstones, skidding to a halt 5 paces away from where I stood. He was shivering violently, his chest heaving, his hands reaching out into the empty, freezing air. Vesper, listen to me, Harrison pleaded, his voice stripped of every shred of arrogance, leaving behind only the raw, desperate panic of a drowning man. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know about Seraphina, about the Vance manuscript. I thought she was pure. I thought she was everything you weren't. He took a stumbling step closer. The engagement, Harrison choked out, the rain streaming down his face like silver tears. The arrangement between our grandfathers, it was always supposed to be the biological daughter. It was supposed to be you. We can fix this. I'll break the Blackwood Foundation away from Sebastian. We can merge our assets. We can run New York together. Vesper, you don't have to walk alone. I slowly turned my head. I looked at Harrison Blackwood through the veil of falling water. He was handsome, even now, soaked, broken, and desperate. He looked like the tragic hero of a 5-act opera, offering his heart on a silver platter in the middle of a tempest. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the very last peppermint, unwrapped it, and let the cellophane fly away into the howling gale. I put the candy into my mouth. The icy sting of mint blossomed on my tongue. Mr. Blackwood, I said, my voice cutting through the roar of the Atlantic with effortless, chilling clarity. Harrison looked at me with a spark of desperate hope in his dark eyes. You spent your whole life looking for an ornament to hang on your wall, I told him, my eyes empty, dark, and infinite as the sea behind me. And when you finally found a mirror, you realized you had no soul to reflect. I took a slow step backward toward the waiting black car at the curb. I did not return to this city to take Seraphina's place, I murmured, watching the last shred of light die in Harrison's eyes. I returned to remind you that some things in this world cannot be bought, cannot be inherited, and will never bow to your pedigree. Harrison fell to one knee on the flooded terrace, his hands pressing into the icy puddles, the rain beating down upon his bent shoulders. Vesper, he whispered into the wet stone. Please, it's freezing out here. I reached the open door of the black sedan. I paused on the threshold. I looked up at the black sky, where the storm clouds churned in an endless, magnificent waltz of fury and shadow. Then freeze, Mr. Blackwood, I said softly. The abyss is very cold. But if you sit there long enough, you'll find you stop shivering. I stepped into the car. Killian slammed the heavy door shut, hopped onto his Ducati, and fired the engine with a roar that shook the glass pavilion to its foundations. The long black car pulled away from the curb, gliding silently down the winding coastal road, leaving the Blackwood Pavilion, the Beaumont legacy, and their ruined, paper crowns drowning in the dark behind us. I rested my chin on my palm, looking at the streaks of water racing across the tinted glass. I was born to perform. Melancholy was my natural palette, a cold, untouchable distance was my armor. And as the city lights vanished into the gray, endless mist of the Atlantic highway, I closed my eyes and smiled, finally enjoying the silence of a world washed clean by the storm.